welcome to the August 2020 GFI commercial seminar series called The Business of Alt Protein. This is a monthly seminar where we dive into different business topics that are relevant to starting and scaling an alternative protein company with different experts on an important area that might get overlooked otherwise, and are able to help provide guidance from their areas of expertise and make it relevant to the work that you all do. And to keep kind of with our recent trend of scaling, you might remember last month we talked about debt financing for alternative protein companies with Silicon Valley Bank. We are glad to be joined with ARCOMurray Design and Build construction firm, which we'll talk about more in a second, to talk about the capacity building, so building manufacturing infrastructure and buildings, which is increasingly becoming more important as it's interest and demand for alternative proteins is almost constantly outpacing supply. You see it, headlines routinely. KFC will launch a plant-based chicken and it will be sold out within 6 hours, things like that. So we really need to, we're finally at an inflection point in the industry where scale is super, super important. So we're trying to focus more on that. And a really key component of that is the building of manufacturing capacity. So very lucky to have these presenters with us. A few very brief reminders. This is a 40-minute presentation, which will be followed by about 20 minutes of Q&A. And we'll ask that you put your Q&A into the Q&A box, which is in the bottom ribbon of your Zoom. And I will moderate those questions and save them for the end. And note that we will be emailing a recording out after to everyone who registered. And we will be taking notes in the agenda document, which I dropped the link to earlier, and I will drop the link to again now. And yeah, I think without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce Elliot Mata and Morgan Waldron from ARCOMurray. It is a large and very experienced design build construction company that has several clients and a lot of experience in the alternative protein space as well as the broader food space. And so we're glad to have them present for about 40 minutes on the things that you want to know or think about if you're building up manufacturing capacity in this space. And I will allow them to dive into the presentation and provide a little more context on themselves and on their organization. So take it away.
All right, great. Thanks, Nate. Really appreciate it. We're really excited to be here today to have this opportunity to talk a little bit about who ARCOMurray is and really to talk about the design build process as it relates to building a plant-based facility. And go into greater detail of how that methodology can be applied to your business and to allow you to scale your business in a timely way. So we'll start by giving a real quick introduction of who we are. So my name's Elliot Mata, as Nate had mentioned. I'm one of the principals here at ARCOMurray and have been in our business for about 15 years. My background is in architecture and civil engineering. And yeah, really my goal and my role in our business is really to focus on our process related industries, and food and beverage and plant-based facilities really kind of falls under that umbrella. And I oversee all facets of that side of our business. So Morgan, I'll allow you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hey everybody. So Morgan Waldron, Director of Business Development here at ARCO. I've been in sales marketing roles for about 15 years now in a handful of different verticals. In 2015, I started an organic catering business in business school with a couple classmates called Range Kitchen. We ended up selling that company to a mid-sized food group here in Chicago, and I joined that company to run their sales team. So I kind of got some exposure to the existing food supply chain, some of the pain points that come with it currently, and really started getting exposure to the alternative protein world at that time. So when I joined ARCO a couple of years ago, I kind of brought with me that passion and interest in the space and helped kickstart our organization's focus in that world. So from a social impact perspective, our organization is extremely bought into this. We're excited to have this partnership with Zach and Nate at GFI and looking forward to a good discussion today.
Great, thanks, Morgan. So we'll start off by talking a little bit about who ARCOMurray is, so everybody has a little bit of context on us. And then we'll really spend the majority of our time talking through the design build methodology, what it is, how it can be applied to your business, how we've seen it being applied to a plant-based facility. And then what we'll do is we'll really take that methodology and walk through step by step of the various nuances of how that methodology can be applied to scaling a business and a production facility, and then wrap it up by talking about what those advantages were as it relates to that type of facility. So I'll kick it over to Morgan to first talk about, spend a little time on ARCOMurray.
Great. So ARCO's been around for about 30 years now. We were founded by two guys, Jeff Cook and Dick Arnoldy, which is where we got the AR and the CR and ARCO. And really in the beginning, our focus was doing some of these big box industrial warehouse buildings. We were kind of following the old Trammell Crow company around the US. Really is one of the first true early adopters of the design build process and really utilizing it in the big box industrial warehouse space. So over the past 10 years, I'd say we've expanded into different verticals there, which we'll talk about shortly. But that's kind of a little bit about where we got our start. So a big part of our value proposition is our national presence. So ARCO's got 29 offices across the US. We've done work in all 50 states, some work in Canada, some work in the Caribbean. And I know we've got some folks overseas probably on this call. We haven't cracked that nut yet going across the pond, but certainly having discussions about it. But for now, really just the North American focus. We're a fairly large organization. We're projected to do about 3.1 billion in revenue this year with the pandemic. And a lot of that is from repeat clients. So a good majority of our business comes from clients that we've been working with for several decades now. Very proud to have some very tight relationships and key customers that we keep following across North America. We're a fairly modest group here, but certainly proud of our accomplishments. The biggest deal for us, I'd say, is being number 7 of ENR's top 100 design build firms. Again, I think that's just a reflection of the relationships we've been able to create over the years and following our customers across the country to put us in that spot. So as I mentioned earlier, we got our start doing these big box industrial warehouse buildings for the first 10, 20 years of our existence. But I'd say over the past decade, we've started to expand into a handful of different verticals. And a big focus for Ellie and I is the food and bev, process manufacturing space, which is kind of what we're going to talk about today. A lot of people know us for our work with Topgolf, which is an entertainment concept, golfing concept here in the US. Topgolf's taken us all over the country. We've built, I think we're up to 55 plus facilities for them. So it's kind of an example of the variety of work that we do. We're starting to get into some indoor agriculture work, some work in the cannabis space, life science, biotech. So really trying to incorporate the design and build process in a bunch of different industries. So just a quick sample of some of the companies we've worked for. As many of you on the call can probably understand, we've got some pretty strict NDAs with a lot of the clients that we work with, especially in the alternative protein space where there's some proprietary information that exists there. So unfortunately, we're not allowed to divulge a handful of the groups that we work for, but this will give you at least an understanding of some of the clients we've completed some projects with over the US. And finally, for my part, another key value proposition for us is our in-house services. We are very proud to be a turnkey provider. All of our project managers are engineers. We do have architects on board. We have civil engineers on board. So we are a one-stop shop organization. I want to make sure I note, though, that we are not not unaccustomed to working with outside vendors as well. So we've got some really strong architect and civil engineer partners that are third party. The key for us is really just that we're at the table from the beginning, so that we can really be, a strong partner from that onset and complete a design build project that Elliot's going to discuss here in more detail. So I'll pass it back to Elliot to kind of get into the design build process in a little bit more depth here.
Great. Thanks, Morgan. Really appreciate it. The bulk of our presentation here will really be revolve around this design, build, delivery process and helping the audience here really understand that model and what advantages that model might bring to your facility or your business as you look to scale or as you look to take on the endeavor of a design and construction project. So many people may have known the design build model, many people may not know it at all. It's kind of one of those buzzwords that you hear sometimes as it relates to design and construction, but it can mean many things to many different people. And as Morgan mentioned, we are one of the true design builders and one of the founders, I feel like, in the design build space. And when you're talking about design build, probably the easiest way to describe what design build is really to compare it to a more traditional design bid build facility, a traditional design bid build model, also referred to as a plan and spec model. And what that model is in really layman's terms is, an end user will go and hire an architect, and that architect will have some engineering consultants that might work alongside that architect or for that architect, and they're going to go and design a facility in its entirety, kind of in a vacuum. And then once they go through that design process, they're going to take those drawings and then send them out to bid. And when they go out to bid to multiple contractors, general contractors, maybe 5, maybe 10, those contractors are going to bid on those drawings, and then the owner is going to select the lowest price likely to do that work. And what ends up happening more times than not is those two entities are really working in a vacuum. So in doing so, there's a lot of indecision that gets made between the architect and the engineers and the contractor, and not really understanding timelines, not really understanding cost. Architects and engineers will say that a contractor doesn't quite understand the design intent. The contractor might say, the architect really didn't understand what this was going to cost, or I can't obtain these materials. And so what ends up happening is, in that whole stream of things, the owner at the end of the day ends up holding all of that risk. And so if there are mistakes in the drawings, or if things are going to take longer, the owner at the end of the day is the one that has to bear that burden. And it can lead to a fairly contentious environment. So if anybody's ever gone through a construction project through this model, it's kind of one of the reasons why construction in general kind of gets a bad rap, because oftentimes things take longer than expected, cost more than expected, and there's that dreaded word that everybody hates, which is change order, right? Which means things are going to cost more money. And so what the design build model does is it takes that methodology and kind of flips it on its upside down and says, look, we're going to funnel everything through one entity that is responsible for both the design and the construction in its entirety. And in doing that, you eliminate these vacuums that are created and these silos, and there's a much more synergistic, collaborative approach to both the design and the construction. And I'll talk through how this works a little bit specifically to a plant-based production facility, but at the end of the day, in going through that model, what we find is that you have lower overall cost on your design and construction projects. You have an earlier transfer of risk, meaning there's less surprises and less cost, and things happen at a much faster pace. And overall, it's just a much more enjoyable experience for everybody involved. It's much more collaborative and partnership. And so design build is getting a lot of momentum, specifically in the US. About half of the projects today, the dollars spent in construction are done utilizing the design build model. And really, we were founded in '92, and you can kind of see over the last 20 or 30 years, really the design build model has really started to ramp up in the United States. So this next graphic, to kind of explain this model a little further and how it might apply to your business, there's a lot going on here, but I'll kind of focus on a couple of key milestones and key points as you look at these graphics. And the top graphic here being the design build model, and the bottom graphic being more that traditional design bid build or plan and spec model. And the biggest thing you want to look at as you consider these two models is the metric of time, right? And you can see the timeline here, and ultimately the benefit of design build is it saves time. It saves time, and when you save time, it saves money. And when you're talking about scaling up a business, or when you're talking about speed to market, time is of the essence. And so the real special sauce, if you will, as it relates to design build, is not necessarily on the back end on the construction side. Construction generally is the same when you go through the model, executing a construction project, but it's all the front end side of things that really creates the difference, and allowing tasks and activities to overlap with more synergy. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what the biggest component that you'll see is that the concept of the design process and the budgeting phase ends up being an iterative phase in the traditional model. Things get designed, and then contractors put prices to them, and they realize things are over budget. And so things have to go back to design, rework the design, value engineer, as it's called, the design, in an effort to try to reduce the cost, and then go back out again to bid and get things bid. And so that just leads to this process of going back and forth, and things kind of being designed and priced in a vacuum. And the design build model allows you to not do that, and allows you to do that holistically, synergistically at one point together. And at that point, we're able to price that and provide a single firm price for a project. And in doing so, that transfers all the risk to the end user, to the design builder at that moment, as opposed to the customer, the end user, the plant facility, holding that risk through the process due to the mistakes in the drawings or things that potentially weren't collaborated on. So at the end of the day, the biggest points that you'll see as it relates to design build is that less overall cost. The Design Build Institute of America, which is the entity that manages the design build, and says that 6%, there's 6% less overall cost in design build projects compared to design bid build, and that the delivery method is 36% faster, which obviously, again, speed to market is a critical component, especially when we're talking about plant-based production facilities. So now I'm going to spend a little bit of time kind of just walking through, we have an end user that wants to build a new facility and they're scaling their business. So how do they go about doing that? And what does that look like? And what are the steps that they need to take? And really looking at this through the lens of the design build methodology and how we would go about doing that, and what things that we would go about doing in an effort to provide those advantages we talk about in terms of less cost, speed to market, and reducing risk. So as I go through this process, you'll see there's several bullet points here on the bottom. There's 6 bullet points, and these are kind of the steps, if you will, that you would take going through the design build model. And really, the front end of this process is probably, again, the most critical component. And if you do all these things right on the front end, it really allows for a seamless construction project, and one that's truly enjoyable and delivering as expected. So we'll spend the majority of our time talking about that front end, those front end components, and going through the multiple decision tree that you have to go through as you consider these things. So one of the first things that you go through as you're considering this is, what are my real estate considerations? How am I going to go about scaling my facility? And there's several things to consider, several options to consider. I think the first thing that I oftentimes talk to end users about is, are we looking to own, or are we looking to lease a facility? And there could be pros and cons to each approach, right? I think when you're looking at owning something, no different than owning a home, you have that real estate, and there's lots of benefits that come with that, the investment, the tax benefits, et cetera. However, when you buy something, you're kind of stuck with that for a fair amount of time, unless you want to, flip out of it and sell it and whatnot. And so you may have reduced flexibility as it relates to the time that you're in that facility and how you're going to scale in that facility. Whereas a lease gives you a little more flexibility in regards to the amount of space that you need potentially, and how long you're going to be in that space, whether it be 5, 10, 15 years, et cetera. However, owning gives you greater flexibility of, improvements and customization. Whereas when you're leasing a facility, you may not have that. You may not be able to do some things in that facility and make some of the improvements that you want. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think one of the biggest differentiators, obviously, is the amount of capital that you're going to spend. How much capital do you have to come up with in an effort to own a facility versus leasing, which obviously can require less capital. After you kind of think through that, kind of simultaneously, probably what you're thinking through is, am I looking to retrofit a facility, or am I looking to build a facility from the ground up, from a greenfield, also referred to? And again, lots of pros and cons to both approaches. The retrofit option, if you can find an existing building, a second generation building that you can actually retrofit, there's probably going to be less upfront costs, right? Because you're not paying for 4 walls and a roof. You can get into the facility quicker because the building already exists, so you're really spending less time in the construction phase. But probably one of the biggest disadvantages that you really need to consider, and that we oftentimes run into with customers in this space, is that you have limitations on your process flow and how you want to lay out your facility, because you're really designing your process flow around an existing building. Whereas in a BuildASuit greenfield opportunity, you're building a building around your process flow, right? You're putting 4 walls and a roof around how you want your facility to operate. And those operating costs can be, if you have the wrong process flow and it's causing your operating costs to go up, that can be a significant impact long-term to your facility. So just a couple of things to consider as it relates to, the retrofit versus BuildASuit. And then again, the BuildASuit is going to probably cost, more money, because you're paying for 4 walls and a roof, and it's going to take longer to do so. I think as you're thinking through all those things, the next thing that comes to mind is, what do I have to do as it relates to expansion? And a lot of times, I think people, end users, are not potentially thinking about expansion when they're first at the onset of considering a new project, but it's something that definitely needs to be considered. Do I need to worry about expansion? What does that expansion look like? Does it look like a building expansion? Maybe it looks like a production floor expansion? I mean, I have leaving space in my facility to expand. Am I adding a second shift, and that's what's going to give me my expansion capability that I need? Or am I just looking to potentially add another location in another geographic market or somewhere else altogether? So definitely just a component that you don't want to forget about, or that you need to think about as you're moving into your project. Another thing, I'm going to skip a couple of bullets here, but one thing I think that oftentimes gets asked and discussed is co-manufacturing an option? Should I be looking at co-manufacturing? Perhaps, that might be the stepping stone to scaling your facility to owning or leasing your own facility. And so there's a lot of benefits to that, right? You eliminate the whole need to lease or own real estate, and the nuance that goes along with that, and the risk that goes along with that. So it really can be a great opportunity as it relates to businesses that are just getting started up and scaling up. But there might be limitations, and that's just something that you have to consider and talk through with the co-manufacturers that you're talking to. Do they have the capacity? You might have limitations on flexibility altogether on what they can produce and how they can do it. And then limited control, what quality control and quality assurance are you getting through that process? So, they're all things that can be considered as you're considering to scale up your business. Okay, so after you kind of think through your real estate considerations, and perhaps you're working with a real estate broker or a developer, and those are a couple of things that you can consider. The next step really, as a design builder, we really start to get involved, at this phase in the game, and start talking about the pre-construction process. And the pre-construction process is probably the most critical component to the design build process. Again, if you go through the pre-construction process diligently and check all the boxes and are working with a trusted partner, you're really setting yourself up for success for those advantages that we're talking about as it relates to reducing your risk, reducing your cost, and overall having a tighter timeline on a project. So things that you have to consider when you're going through pre-construction process. And some of this is nuanced and specific to our industry, so I'll try to keep it high level, but it's really critical as it relates to the timing and the cost of projects. Looking at your site analysis and looking at your zoning and entitlement. If you're going to potentially build a building, what does the existing conditions of that site look like? Is there a significant amount of topography? Do we have to consider, how we're going to zone the facility, zone the land? Is the land entitled? And all those things can take can really vary your timeline depending on the nuance if it's not zoned or entitled specifically for what you're looking to do as a plant-based facility. If you're going to go into an existing building, really looking at that existing building and understanding the nuances of that building is a critical component. A lot of times we're kind of looking with an end user might be looking kind of with blinders on and saying this facility, this space will work really, really great for my production and what I'm looking to do. But have you considered some of the other ancillary components of that building if it's a second generation building? And what I mean by that is, does the building have enough bathrooms? Does it meet ADA standards, which is the American Disabilities Act for the buildings? Does it have enough parking? Are there other things that are antiquated that need to be upgraded or fixed in the facility? And so all those things can really add to timeline and cost of a project if they're not considered on the front end if you're looking to scale into an existing building. If you're looking to buy a new property, there's a fair amount of surveying that has to be done to ensure that the land that you're buying is a good piece of land, going through environmental surveys, geotechnical, which is a subsurface report to understand the existing conditions of that subsurface. Is the property buildable? What is it going to take to put foundations in a building on this property due to the subsurface conditions? And then lastly, what kind of topography do we have on that property? And if there's significant grade changes on the property, does it mean that we're going to have to add a lot of retaining walls, or we're going to have to, in general, spend a lot of money on cut and fill, which is bringing earthwork onto the site or taking earthwork off of the site as it relates to your construction project? So a little bit nuanced, but could be really, really critical components to building a new facility and as it relates to cost and time on a project. And then I think, as we think about specifically a plant-based production facility, we're talking about a type of project and design that really needs to take into consideration the process flow and how the equipment is going to lay out in a facility. What are the adjacencies of the equipment? What are some of the ancillary programming that we need to consider? How much office space do we need? How much R&D lab space do we need? How much mechanical room space do we need? All these things that are really, really critical. And you have to spend the time really massaging that layout and understanding exactly what makes sense from an operations standpoint first, and then getting that down on paper before you can really take the next steps of facilitating a hard construction price as well as moving into the design phase. One of the things I think that oftentimes gets overlooked when you're considering a new project is, what are my equipment needs? Who am I buying equipment from? And what is the lead time for those? And so this is the same time that has to be considered and figured out. Sometimes folks feel like, well, we can figure out the equipment once we get a little farther down the road. And that really is not the best way to go about it. The best way to go about it is start thinking about those things up front so that we can incorporate all the nuance that's critical to that equipment as it relates to utilities and as it relates to space allocation and such. Okay, so once you get through that pre-construction phase, now we get to the point in the design build model where we're really validating and being able to put pencil to paper and helping our customers understand exactly what this project's going to cost. And it's not until this point in time that a customer is really committing to anything. They haven't committed to spending any money up to this point. They've worked in partnership with the design builder in an effort to find a solution and find something that's going to work for them. And at this point, we dollarize all of those things and help understand not only cost and timing in an effort to move forward with a design builder. So some of the things that will be done at this phase is going through some preliminary engineering, doing some various architectural design, structural design, civil design, all the nuanced front-end design in an effort to help you as the end user understand what it is that you're getting for your price, right? And in doing so, we quantify the scope. We prepare what is called a performance specification, which is a extremely detailed scope that helps understand exactly what it is that's being done to a facility, whether it's a new build or a retrofit, so that we can establish that firm price. You know, and sometimes we'll go through a budgeting process first, which is a plus or minus probably 10 to 20% phase to help understand, you know, are we in the ballpark? Does this thing make sense? And then we move to that hard price so that we can know exactly what it is. And so the end user can know exactly what it is that they're paying for, and then we eliminate all the scope gaps, and there's no surprises. One of the things that is beneficial to this process and the design build model is it really allows us to dollarize decisions and eliminate that process of things being designed in a vacuum and not understanding exactly what that's going to cost. And sometimes what we'll do is we'll create a shopping list, so to speak, of options, right? We call them alternates, and they might be things that are nice to haves, or maybe they're things that we can look to potentially eliminate from the scope to reduce the cost. And so we'll oftentimes have a proposal that might have 30, 40, 50 items that a end user can consider, and they can really dollarize decisions and say, hey, I'd really like to have this, but what is that going to cost me? And understand exactly that critical component. We wrap all that up by putting together a detailed project schedule. And that project schedule is inclusive of the very first onset of, you know, as you're looking for your real estate or what your needs are from a real estate standpoint, to turning over the keys and you commissioning your facility and operating and having product go out the door. And then one other critical component, again, at this time is releasing those equipment vendors to, you know, purchasing that equipment at this time. You know, there could be long lead times for a lot of equipment, and making sure that the equipment timelines are aligned with the construction timelines is a critical component, and ensuring that the timing aligns so that contractors aren't waiting for equipment or we have an empty building with no equipment. Okay, so once all that is done, that is when we actually finally say, okay, this is what's being provided. Here's how long it's going to take, and it's at that time that a contract is executed. And at that point, we go into a detailed design phase, and that detailed design phase is what you see in terms of the construction documents, the documents we're actually going to build off of. And so when we go through that detailed design phase, the critical component to that is that you have a trusted design partner that understands your industry, understands the you know, alternative protein, plant-based industry, food and beverage nuances. And one of the critical components to that is, what do we have to consider as it relates to food safety and certifications, right? Are we going to be applying, you know, 3A sanitary standards? Are we going to be applying SQF standards? Do we have to consider, you know, FDA requirements in this case, right, with a plant-based facility? Are we following the Food Safety Modernization Act, which we likely are? Are we following Global Food Safety Initiative? So really diving into the safety components as it relates to food is a critical component that has to happen during the design phase. And if it doesn't, it can really lead to extended costs, timelines, and reworking things because something wasn't considered as it relates to food safety. I think, you know, one of the advantages of the design build process as well is now things are being done all using 3D modeling, right? And so design is no longer lives in a 2D world, it lives in a 3D world. And in doing so, it allows us to really integrate all of the equipment and the nuance with the piping and the nuance with the mechanical systems, building systems, structural systems, and really allow end users to walk through their facility to understand their production flow, but also understand how their building is going to be constructed or how their building is going to be retrofitted to accommodate their processing needs. And I think one of the most critical components as you're thinking through all this and as we go through this design phase, and this again is one of the nuances and the benefits of the design build model, is that as you go through that design, you have to ensure that you are meeting all the original requirements that were set up during that validation step. And that's really what allows us to have the advantage of not having to go back and forth and have this iterative process, is that entire time you're going through that detailed design, you're meeting the requirements that has already been set up during that validation step. And then you're ready to go through permitting and enter into construction. Once you get to this phase, if you've done everything well on the front end and your design builder has worked alongside understanding your operations in great detail, the construction phase can actually go fairly smoothly and can potentially be the easiest parts of the entire process. Having the right design builder that is sophisticated, though, and utilizing some of the most critical tools in today's industry is critical. Some of the things that we utilize is we digitize most of what we're doing. Most of the drawings are now handled on iPads out in the field, and we're utilizing project management software called Procore and utilizing different softwares to allow the project management and the construction process to be streamlined. But more importantly, it allows the communication between the design builder and the customer to be streamlined, and allows it to be effective and ensures that nothing is being missed and nothing is surprising. One of the critical components as it relates to construction that I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about is safety. Similar to the food and beverage industry and how critical safety is, construction is a very dangerous field as well, and so our safety efforts are really, really critical, and ensuring that you run a safe project is critical. So we have a detailed and very elaborate safety program as we move through the construction phase. And I think, once you get through this process and we get through, the construction project, at the end of the day, you want to get to the completion phase. And I think the most critical components to that completion phase is we're going to go through a punch list and ensure that all the scope was completed and you have certificate of occupancy from the municipality. But one of the parts that is critical to a plant-based facility or alternative protein facility, a food and beverage facility, is what does that equipment startup and commissioning phase look like? And how is that going to be integrated into the construction phase and into the final turnover of the building? How are we going to coordinate the vendors? How long is it going to take the vendors to do their startup? How long is the commissioning phase going to take for the end user to go through that process and to get through all the bugs and the integration and some of the nuance associated with running their plant? And so that's all critical to the design builder being part of that process and helping the end user get through that. And then at the end of the day, you get to that point, you're going through maybe some certification process and validation process for maybe some process, SQF or some other things. And then, ensuring that a good maintenance and training program is laid out and that a good warranty program is in place is critical to ensure that, for a minimum of 1 year, all parts and material and labor is warranted, and that there's no issues that arise after the fact and after the design builder is done with the project, right? So there's a lot there, but I kind of walk through in gory detail of the process. But if you take anything away from all of this, the design build model and what it is and why is really just these advantages, right? I think, if you have the right partner, from beginning to end, I think it's really probably the most critical component, right? They have skin in the game with you all along the way. And it truly is a much more enjoyable process if you have the right partner. And if you have that right partner, at the end of the day, the design build model is going to render a project that costs less, takes less time, and ultimately at the end of the day, reduced risk from the end user, and leaving you with no surprises and a project at the end of the day that you're happy with, and that now you can focus on running your business, which is really what you're great at. So that is it. I thank everybody again for listening in. I really appreciate it. I'll kick it back to Nate at this point to see what questions we have and that we can hopefully answer.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And everyone, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A feature in Zoom, and I will ask them. I have some pre-questions that I will dive into, and then we'll get back to the Q&A box. So what would maybe be some of the biggest differences between a plant-based production facility and a facility that is doing cellular agriculture, so like cultivated meat or fermentation, which might be more like might be more similar to a bioethanol plant that's somewhere between a bioethanol plant and a pharmaceutical grade facility. You know, how different or similar would plant-based be to that, and what would some of the big differences or considerations be?
Yeah. Morgan, do you want to take a stab at that a little bit?
Yeah, so we didn't get into a ton of the cell-based stuff here. I think the majority of the focus was plant-based. You know, the cell-based, to your point, Nate, is more like a lab environment. So it's more similar to some of our life science biotech projects than it would be an actual food production facility. So I think you're probably running into a lot of equipment differences there, and the way the facility lays out. You know, the engineering that goes into it is very different. The cell-based stuff is very engineering focused. So a lot of upfront discussion needs to be had about the flow and the process. But I think those are the main differences. Is, you know, you're dealing more with a lab-based program. With the cellular stuff, the plant-based is kind of more closely resembled to a actual food production facility.
Yeah, I think to elaborate on that a little too, and as it relates to that lab space, I think you're going to have the greatest differences in your probably your HVAC design and just the overall environment that has to be added into the program, which can add some significant costs, you know, that you don't see more in a typical just production facility in a food type plant-based production facility. Yeah,
definitely. The sterility is going to be a huge part of that. So kind of in the same vein, in terms of retrofitting opportunities, are there kind of collateral industries or facilities that you think there are retrofitting opportunities relevant to either plant-based or cell-based? So like, you know, breweries, would they be potentially a good fit for cell-based, or would, you know, something like, you know, is there a collateral industry that might be good for plant-based companies to move into?
That's a good question. I don't, off the top of my head, I haven't really thought about it too much, but I think that, you know, any facility that gives you the flexibility that perhaps was an existing manufacturing facility in some capacity would be a good you know, opportunity probably to be retrofitted. And I say that because it probably already has you know, some of the utilities that are necessary for the facility, you know, some of the power demand and some of the water and such demand and things of that nature. And so I think that can lend itself well. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be an existing, you know, food facility or anything like of that nature, but just something that lends itself well with some of those existing utilities. It would be how I would respond to that.
And it's back to the differences between the two, Nate. You're right. I think, you know, you look at, we built a handful of breweries, and these cell-based facilities, as new as that industry is, there's a lot of similarities there between cell-based production facilities and these breweries. I mean, they're essentially growing cells in beer vats. So, you know, if you can find a former brewery, that's probably a perfect fit. But to Elliot's point, I think the ability to retrofit is there no matter what the previous use was.
Great. And then I guess maybe one more question relevant to retrofitting from Michael McHarg. Given food safety and restrictions for new production facilities, have you seen a preference for new facilities versus retrofitting older facilities? So like, for example, you know, it seems like it might be easier to build a new facility unless it was already used for food or something like that. But he also says there seems like an opportunity for retrofitting stranded assets, like a big box store that's gone out of business or a mall, but is not sure whether the cost of bringing those facilities up to food safety code would be cost prohibitive. And it sounds like maybe utilities is like another issue we might not have thought about.
Yeah, it's definitely not, it definitely can be done, right? And I would say more times than not, if that's the only hurdle that you're trying to overcome, that it would be more cost effective to retrofit, and you can still meet the requirements that you're looking for as it relates to food safety. It just depends on the extent of what that might look like. But more times than not, the cost to to modify an existing building is still going to be significantly less than what it's going to cost to build it from scratch. You know, just you might be making some concessions along the way, and there might be some nuance to it of how you're going to accomplish those, but it definitely can be done. I mean, I would say we see more and more retrofits than we see BuildASuits, and that's just a testament to, you know, people are able to find existing buildings, even just speculative warehouse buildings, and then convert them into you know, a production facility that they're looking for, and still meet all the safety standards and requirements.
Great. Okay, so changing gears a little bit, this is a more specific question from Craig Johnston, asking what the typical equipment item cost to overall project cost ratio is that you see, maybe in plant-based meat or dairy, and if you can, you know, industries that might be similar to cell-based, but I mean, can you even have a typical ratio?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. It's a tough one, right? Because every type of facility, it can be quite different, and depending on the size and the scale, and depending on you know, exactly what you're seeing. So I think that, you know, I would say anywhere from you know, we'll see sometimes where the construction improvement costs are the same cost as the equipment. And we'll see situations where the equipment costs can be as much as twice as much of the construction costs, more like in a retrofit type of situation. And if we're building from the ground up, then you could see that the other way around, right? Where the construction costs can be, you know, twice that of the equipment cost. So it's a pretty loaded question. And I don't know that I can answer definitively, but somewhere in that realm.
Great, fair enough. So this is a question from Sylvia Hootner, and it is about site selection, which we didn't quite dive into. So this is a great question. What are the most important considerations on where to build your production plant? Maybe like, you know, things that people might not obviously think of.
Yeah, so site selection, you know, that is a critical component to looking at where you want to build. And I think that, yeah, I think first and foremost, you got to look at the region that you're looking at, right? And what is it going to take to build in a certain marketplace? And different marketplaces have different challenges that go along with them as it relates to construction, you know? And some of those challenges are everything from the permitting and zoning and entitlement process that I kind of talked about. And then some of them are just what is it going to take at the end of the day to modify, to you know, to do the earthwork and do, you know, what is it going to take to build a building potentially on a piece of site. So on a various sites. So I think, you know, there's a lot of those components that you have to consider, you know, as you're looking at your site selection. But I think at the end of the day, you know, you have to look at what are the things that are going to impact your timeline and what are the things that are going to impact your cost. And that can be several different things depending on if you're going into an existing building or if you're looking at or if you're looking to buy a piece of land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it would also like depend on what kind of products you're building. So a lot of like fermentation companies, for example, will want to be close to the side stream, like CO2 or sugar or whatever that they're using. So it's going to greatly depend, right?
Right.
So kind of another line of questioning around when is a company ready to build a facility? You know, is it typically better for maybe a company to go through the co-manufacturing space first, or, you know, maybe what are some of the metrics that you look for to assess whether someone is ready to scale up into a larger facility?
Yeah, that, you know, oftentimes I think that's tough for us to answer. You know, because at the end of the day, I think it's what is the end user's, what is their tolerance for risk, right? And so what is their tolerance and belief in their product? And are they ready to make that leap into investing in the real estate or investing in a lease and investing in buying their own equipment? So I don't know. Morgan, do you have a better answer than that?
It's a really interesting one with this world, because the amount of capital that's flowing into alternative-based proteins right now is, I don't think we've seen anything like this in quite some time. I mean, maybe you could say cannabis, but people are placing big bets, and there's a lot of capital out there to utilize. Now, if the decision is to go co-manufacture to alleviate some of the upfront costs and some of the risk, I think we see a lot of startup companies do that, because I'd say 90% of the plant-based, alternative-based world right now are startup companies. So we see them starting in co-manufacturing spaces, and once they prove out the concept a little further, and start bringing in revenue, and get further capital investments through venture, then I think we're starting to have those conversations with groups that are looking to take on their own in-house operations and scale. So it's just really unique, because this is a world that I don't think we've seen too often, with the amount of capital that's pouring into it very quickly.
Yeah, it's very exciting. So in a similar vein, then, is there kind of a minimum project size that someone would want to undertake in order to work with a design build firm like yours?
Yeah, I think, more times than not, when there's complexity to a project is when it makes the most sense to work with a company like ours. But we do a fair amount of what we would consider to be smaller projects. I mean, our project size is as small as $500,000 for a construction project, up to, tens of millions of dollars for a new facility coming out of the ground. So, we're pretty flexible in that regard. And, our goal, a company like ours, I mean, we're invested in this space. We're invested in growing in this industry. And so, oftentimes we're doing projects of a smaller scale in an effort to continue to grow with the industry.
Yeah, that's great. I love the willingness to do that. Smart. Okay, so let's say that, well, I guess this is somewhat related from No Go Goal. Are there any real estate companies that you work with, maybe, that are really interested in the space, specifically landlords or investors, is what she asks.
Go ahead.
You want me to take that, Elliot?
Yep.
Did you tee this one up, Nate?
No, but I figured I might.
This is, so a lot of the conversations I've been having with venture capital this is a big pain point. So the answer to the question directly is no. I think when you talk to building owners, their biggest thing is alleviating as much risk as possible. So when you talk about risk in terms of end users that are in their buildings, you want someone with super high credit, that's been around for a while, has proven revenue for decades. That's their best client. And of course, this space is so new that there aren't a lot of companies that exist like that yet. My argument, and I think everybody on this panel would agree, that because of the growth we've seen and all the capital pouring in, that these landlords really need to start taking a look at this. And we've had side conversations with GFI and some of our developer partners that we work with on other verticals, to say, hey, like, you guys really need to start focusing on this. Can we put together some sort of national program where, we bring you in to conversations that we're having with end users in the alternative protein space, to help with some of that development. Because most of the companies we talk to, they don't want to be in real estate. They want to focus on their business, and really hone in on their product. They don't want to worry about the real estate side. So the answer to your question is we're working on it. I think the answer now is no, but I think it's coming shortly, and I think you'll start to see more real estate companies really starting to focus on this plant-based world.
Yeah, that's great. I'm excited to hear more about that. So I think we should go ahead and wrap up before we get kicked off by another webinar that I know is coming up here. So thank you both so much. What's the best way for folks to get in contact?
Go ahead, Morgan.
Yeah, I mean, I think in contact with ARCO.
Just, yeah, LinkedIn or your website.
Yeah, both are great options. I think we'll hopefully send out Elliot and I's information. If there are any questions that we can follow up on that weren't answered here, yeah, absolutely follow us on LinkedIn and you know, connect with me and Elliot both. And we'd welcome the opportunity to have conversations with some of these startup plant-based alternative protein companies. We're doing a lot of it already. My role is really just try to talk to as many people as possible. So if you guys want to reach out to me directly, would love to have an initial conversation for sure.
Well, great. We really appreciate your time and expertise, Morgan and Elliot. We will be all hearing from you more, I'm sure. And yeah, everyone, we will be sending this recording out as well as our notes and the slide deck. And I also did drop in the chat a link to sign up for next month's presentation, which is Mark Warner talking about scaling industrial bioprocesses. So more on the fermentation and animal cell culture side of things. So hope that some of you will be able to attend that. And I hope you all have a very productive rest of the month until next time. All right.
Thank you.